This is not a drill. And I am not exaggerating when I tell you that what just happened between General Motors and the Canadian government is one of the most explosive corporate showdowns we have seen in years. And if you are an American worker, an American investor, or just somebody who cares about where this country is headed, you need to sit down. You need to pay attention. And you need to hear every single word of what I am about to tell you because this story is moving fast. It is getting ugly, and the consequences are going to ripple across this entire continent for years to come. Here is what happened. General Motors, one of the most iconic American companies ever built, a company that helped win World War II, a company that put America on wheels, just gutted its operations in Canada. And I mean gutted them. They slashed an entire production shift at their Oshawa assembly plant in Ontario. They threw roughly 500 of their own employees out the door. And when you count the supply chain workers, the parts suppliers, the small businesses that depend on that plant, we are talking about over 1,200 people who woke up one morning with good-paying manufacturing jobs and went to bed that night with absolutely nothing. And folks, that is not the worst part because this was not even the first time GM did this. No, no, no. Just a few months before this, back in October, GM shut down their entire Bright Drop electric van operation at the Cami assembly plant in Ingersoll, Ontario. And that move alone wiped out over 1,000 jobs. So if you are keeping score at home, that is 2 massive plant cuts in under 6 months. That is over 2,000 Canadian manufacturing jobs just evaporated. And the reason GM gave was that they needed to realign production. They needed to adjust to the evolving trade environment. And you know what that is code for, right? That is code for tariffs. That is code for the 25% import duties that have been slapped on vehicles crossing the border. And here is where this story gets absolutely wild because the Canadian government did not just sit there and take it. They did not just issue a strongly worded statement and move on. No. Canada's industry minister, Melanie Joly, came out swinging. And I mean swinging hard. She went on national television and said point blank that the Canadian government is going to claw back every single dollar of public funding that was given to General Motors. She said, and I am paraphrasing here, we gave you taxpayer money to create jobs in this country, and you took that money and you moved those jobs to Indiana. So, we are coming to get our money back. And let me tell you something, she was not bluffing because just weeks before this, her office had already served a default notice to Stellantis over their idled plant in Bampton. So Ottawa has made it crystal clear that there is a new policy in town. If you take Canadian taxpayer money and then abandon Canadian workers, the government is going to come after you and they are going to demand every cent back. And that, my friends, is a seismic shift in how governments deal with multinational corporations. Now, before you go anywhere, I need you to do something for me. If you are finding this information valuable, if you want to stay ahead of these massive economic shifts that are reshaping the job market and the auto industry, hit that subscribe button right now. Tap the bell icon so you never miss an update because stories like this are breaking every single day. And I promise you, you do not want to be the last one to find out. Now let me take you deeper into what is really going on here because the surface level story is dramatic enough, but when you peel back the layers, it gets so much more disturbing. General Motors did not just cut a shift in Oshawa. They simultaneously hired 250 temporary workers at their Fort Wayne, Indiana plant. And both of those plants build the exact same truck, the Chevrolet Silverado. So, let me spell this out for you in plain English. GM took 50,000 units of truck production out of Canada and moved it directly to American soil. And on one hand, you could say, well, that is great for American workers, right? Those are American jobs. But hold on, it is not that simple. Because here is the thing that nobody is talking about. Those new hires in Fort Wayne are temporary workers. They are not getting the same pay. They are not getting the same benefits. They are not getting the same job security as the 1,200 people who just lost everything in Oshawa. So who really wins here? The answer is General Motors wins because they are exploiting the tariff situation to restructure their labor costs. They are using trade policy as cover to move production to wherever they can pay the least. And the workers on both sides of the border, the American workers and the Canadian workers, are the ones getting squeezed. And this is where Warren Buffett enters the picture. And when Warren Buffett talks, the entire financial world stops and listens. This is a man who built Berkshire Hathaway into a trillion-dollar empire. This is the Oracle of Omaha. And what he has been saying about tariffs and the auto industry should send chills down your spine. Buffett once held a significant stake in General Motors. He bought 10 million shares back in 2017 at about $34 a share. And for a while it looked like a vintage Buffett value play by a beaten-down American icon and waited for the turnaround. But Buffett did not wait. He started selling GM shares in 2022, dumped another 10 million in 2023, and eventually exited the position entirely. And when people asked him why, when analysts tried to figure out what the Oracle saw that the rest of us missed, the answer was hiding in plain sight. Buffett has always said that the auto industry is quite too tough. He and his late partner Charlie Munger talked about it for decades. The margins are razor thin, the capital requirements are enormous, the labor costs are crushing, and the regulatory environment is a minefield. And now you add tariffs on top of all that, and you have got a recipe for exactly what we are seeing right now. Plant closures, mass layoffs, and corporations playing countries against each other to squeeze out every last dollar of profit. And Buffett has not been quiet about how he feels about tariffs in general. At the Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting in May of last year, he stood up in front of thousands of shareholders and said something that I think every American needs to hear. He said trade should not be a weapon. He said the United States should be looking to trade with the rest of the world. We should do what we do best, and they should do what they do best. And he went even further. He called tariffs an act of war to some degree. And he warned that when you have 7.5 billion people around the world who do not like you very well, and 300 million Americans crowing about how great they are doing, that is not just wrong. It is not just unwise. It is dangerous. And you can agree with him or disagree with him, but you cannot ignore the fact that this man has been right about markets and economies for over 60 years. And right now he is sitting on $347 billion in cash because he does not see enough attractively priced investments in this environment. And when the greatest investor of our lifetime is sitting on the sidelines with that kind of money, you better believe he sees storm clouds that the rest of us are just starting to notice. Now, let me connect all of these dots for you because this GM Canada situation is not an isolated incident. It is a symptom of something much bigger and much more troubling. The entire North American auto industry is in crisis mode right now. Tariffs on vehicles from Canada and Mexico hit 25%, and that has thrown the entire supply chain into chaos. For decades, cars and car parts moved freely across these borders under trade agreements that created millions of jobs across all three countries. But now those agreements are being torn up and the auto companies are scrambling to figure out where to build, what to build, and how to survive. And the numbers are staggering. General Motors alone took a $7.2 billion write-down on its electric vehicle business at the end of last year. Most of that was from ending contracts with suppliers because their EV sales just never materialized the way they expected. The bright drop van that was supposed to be the future of commercial electric vehicles. That plant in Ingersoll was designed to build 50,000 vans a year. And you know how many they actually sold? Fewer than 2,000 in 2024. And even in the first 3 quarters of 2025, total sales were under 4,000 units. That is less than 10% of what the plant was built to produce. So when GM says they shut down CAMI because of weak EV demand, they are not wrong. But they are not telling the whole story, either because the tariffs made it economically impossible to keep that plant running even if demand had been stronger. And the workers know it. The union knows it, and the Canadian government knows it. And speaking of the union, let me tell you about Unifor, which is Canada's largest private sector union, what they have been saying and doing, because it is absolutely remarkable. Their national president, Lana Payne, came out and accused GM of caving to Donald Trump. She said GM made a conscious decision to prioritize appeasing the American administration over protecting Canadian workers. And she said those workers are now paying for that appeasement with their jobs. And at the local level, the union president at the Cami plant in Ingersoll, a guy named Mike Van Bulk, went on record and said that if GM tries to remove a single piece of equipment from that plant, his workers are prepared to occupy the facility. Think about that for a second. We are talking about auto workers in 2026 threatening to physically take over a factory. That is how desperate and how angry people are. And meanwhile, the local union president at Oshawa, Jeff Gray, described watching his members walk into what they knew would be their final shift as heartbreaking. He said, "These are people who took these jobs thinking they finally had something stable, something they could build a life on. And a few short years later, because of things completely out of their control, they have nothing." And here is what makes this even more painful. While GM is pulling out of Canada, Toyota is moving in. Toyota just launched new RAV4 production in Ontario, and Minister Jolie made a point of highlighting that contrast. She basically said, "Look, if GM does not want to invest in Canada anymore, fine, we will invest in other players." And some people interpreted that as a veiled reference to Chinese automakers because there has been a lot of talk in Canada about inviting companies like BYD to set up manufacturing operations there. And if that happens, if China starts building cars in Canada while American companies are pulling out, the geopolitical implications are enormous. You are talking about a fundamental realignment of the North American auto industry that could take decades to sort out. And let me bring this back to what it means for you, for the average American watching this video right now, because you might be thinking, okay, GM is closing plants in Canada, that is Canada's problem, but it is not. It is very much your problem too. When tariffs raise the cost of production, those costs do not just disappear. They get passed on to you, the consumer, and industry executives are now openly warning that car prices are going to go up. A top executive at Sonic Automotive said during their earnings call that the tariffs are too high and automakers are going to start passing those costs through. He said, "The affordability crisis is coming. Maybe not today, maybe not next month, but by the middle of this year, you are going to start feeling it when you walk into a dealership. New car prices have nowhere to go but up," he said. And they are not going to sit back and lose billions and billions of dollars. They just cannot. Toyota confirmed that tariffs cost them roughly $8 billion in just 9 months, and they called those tariffs highly disruptive and unsustainable. General Motors and Ford have each absorbed billions in tariff costs and said they expect to keep bleeding money in 2026. And the kicker is, the Supreme Court actually struck down some of the reciprocal tariffs recently, but the auto industry-specific tariffs are still in place because they were imposed under national security grounds through a different legal authority. So even with the court ruling the 25% duties on imported vehicles and parts from Canada and Mexico are not going anywhere, at least not yet. And that means the pressure on automakers and the pressure on your wallet is only going to intensify. Let me paint you a picture of what this looks like on the ground. Oshawa, Ontario is a city that was built by the auto industry. Generations of families worked at that GM plant, fathers and sons and granddaughters. It was the backbone of the community, and now over 1,000 of those jobs are gone. And the ripple effects are devastating. The restaurants near the plant that depend on shift workers coming in for lunch, the daycare centers, the barber shops, the local hardware stores, all of them are going to feel this. And it is not just Oshawa, it is Ingersoll too. In St. Catharines, where GM's propulsion plant has been cut in half to just 600 workers, and Bampton, where Stellantis idled their plant across Ontario. The auto industry is being hollowed out, and the human cost of that is staggering. And you know what reminds me of it? Reminds me of what happened to Flint, Michigan. And if you know anything about Flint, you know that story does not have a happy ending. GM was born in Flint. It was the lifeblood of that city. And then over the decades, plant by plant, job by job, GM pulled out. And the local and state governments that had given GM billions in incentives got nothing back. And Flint became a shell of what it once was. The poverty, the crime, the water crisis, all of it traces back to the collapse of the auto industry in that city. And people in Oshawa and Ingersoll are looking at Flint right now, and they are terrified that they are looking at their own future. Now I want to shift gears slightly and talk about the bigger investment picture here, because whether you own GM stock or not, what is happening in the auto industry right now is a canary in the coal mine for the broader economy. When Warren Buffett dumps his entire position in an American automaker and then goes on national television and says trade should not be used as a weapon, and then his company issues quarterly reports warning that tariffs could have adverse consequences on most, if not all, of their operating businesses, that is not just one billionaire complaining. That is a signal. That is a flashing red warning light. And the fact that Berkshire Hathaway is sitting on nearly $350 billion in cash, the most they have ever held, that tells you that the smartest money in the world does not see enough certainty in this economy to put capital to work, and that should concern every single one of us. GM's own projections tell an interesting story, too. They have forecasted earnings per share of 11 to 13 for 2026, which would be a huge jump from the $327 they earned in 2025. But here is the catch. 2025's numbers were distorted by that massive $7.2 billion EV write-down, so the comparison is misleading, and even if GM hits those targets, the underlying business is still dealing with tariff headwinds, declining EV market share, a hostile trade environment with one of their biggest production partners, and a Canadian government that is actively trying to claw back subsidies. So, yes, the stock is trading at more than double what Buffett originally paid for it. But Buffett does not care about what the stock price was. He cares about what the business looks like going forward, and he clearly decided the auto industry is not where he wants to be. And this brings me to something that I think is really important and that nobody else is saying. We are witnessing the end of an era in North American manufacturing, the era where you could build a car with parts from Canada, Mexico, and the United States seamlessly, where supply chains were optimized for efficiency, not politics, where workers on both sides of every border benefited from the free flow of goods and capital. That era is dying, and what is replacing it is an era of economic nationalism where countries are weaponizing trade, where corporations are playing governments against each other, and where workers everywhere are getting caught in the crossfire. And whether you think tariffs are a necessary tool to protect American jobs or a dangerous weapon that hurts everybody, the reality on the ground is clear. Real people are losing real jobs. Real communities are being devastated, and the auto industry as we knew it is being fundamentally reshaped in real time. And so, here's my question for you, and I really want to hear your answer in the comments below. Do you think what GM did was the right business decision? Do you think Ottawa was right to demand their money back? Do you think tariffs are helping or hurting American workers in the long run? Drop your thoughts below, because this is a conversation that matters. This is not just about cars. This is about the kind of economy we want to live in. And while you are down there, if you have not already, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell, because I am going to be following this story as it develops. There are more plant decisions coming. There are more trade negotiations happening. The USMCA agreement is up for review in 2026, and whatever comes out of that is going to determine the fate of millions of jobs across North America. So, do not miss what comes next. Let me also address something that I know some of you are thinking. Some of you are thinking, good, let Canada deal with it. Those jobs should be in America anyway. And I understand that instinct, I really do. But here is what I need you to understand. When you disrupt a supply chain that took 30 years to build, you do not just magically create better jobs in America overnight. What you create is chaos. What you create is uncertainty. And uncertainty is the enemy of investment. It is the enemy of job creation. It is the enemy of economic growth. And we are seeing that play out right now. Automakers are not rushing to build new plants in the United States. They are freezing capital expenditures. They are delaying product launches. They are hiring temporary workers instead of permanent ones, and they are passing costs along to consumers. That is not winning. That is everybody losing at different speeds. And I keep coming back to what Buffett said because I think it is the most important thing anyone has said about this entire situation. He said, the more prosperous the rest of the world becomes, it will not be at our expense. The more prosperous we will become and the safer we will feel. And that is not just investment wisdom. That is common sense. But somewhere along the way, we forgot that. We forgot that trade is not a zero-sum game. That when your neighbor does well, you do well. And when you burn bridges with your closest allies and trading partners, eventually you are the one standing alone. The GM Canada situation is a case study in how quickly things can unravel when trade policy becomes unpredictable. 3 years ago, GM invested over $1 billion to retool the CAMI plant for electric vehicle production. They made promises. The government gave subsidies. Workers retrained. Communities organized their futures around that investment. And then the tariffs hit and the EV market softened and the political wind shifted. And just like that, over 1,000 families in Ingersoll were left with nothing. And another 200 families in Oshawa were left with nothing. And the whole thing could have been avoided if there had been a stable, predictable trade framework that gave businesses the confidence to invest for the long term instead of scrambling to react to whatever policy change comes next. I want to leave you with this thought. The American auto industry was once the pride of this nation. It represented everything great about American innovation, American manufacturing, and American ambition. Henry Ford built the assembly line. GM built the American middle class. And Chrysler showed the world that even when you fall down, you can get back up. But that industry was built on a foundation of stability, of long-term planning, of partnerships across borders and across generations. And right now, that foundation is cracking. And the question is not whether it will break. The question is what we are going to build in its place. And right now, nobody has a good answer to that question. Not the automakers, not the politicians, not the union leaders, and not even the Oracle of Omaha. Thank you for reading. Thank you for staying all the way to the end. I do not take your time for granted. If this video opened your eyes to something you did not know, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and I will see you in the next